Night vision is an incredibly daunting subject. For one, the devices are magic. And for two, they're expensive. And three, there's so much information out there that it's hard to know what information really matters to you, the consumer, when it comes to purchasing a device. Do you buy a Gen 2 PVS 14? Do you buy a Gen 3 PVS 7? Or do you go all the way up and buy something like RNVG or PVS 31s, or do you go all the way up to Panos instead of buying a house? There's a lot of information out there that people are constantly juggling and trying to figure out what really matters for making a sound purchasing decision. And at T.REX Arms, it's one of our objectives to take these subjects as complicated as night vision, or communications, or shooting, and how to learn how to shoot, and to distill the information down that applies to 95% of you all. Yes, there's the 5% of nerds who want that nerd knowledge. They want to really deep dive and understand it. But the reality is most of us, myself included, really only need the bare bones information to make a decision on what equipment we should run, and then we get out there and train. So we've brought in Scott from Nocturnality. He's a night vision subject matter expert. He's been in the game for give or take a decade. He makes custom night vision units for people and provides all kinds of interesting solutions. And he's also providing T.REX Arms with a few units that we can offer as well. But the most important thing that we are bringing to you guys is his knowledge and information in the simple information that 95% of us need, including myself, and then that 5% nerd knowledge that some of you guys might really want to get into to fully understand what these devices can do and what they're capable of. This video series is going to be split into two parts. The first part, this one right here, is the 95% of information that 95% of you all need to know, and then the next part is going to be that nerd knowledge for those of you that want to really dive down the rabbit hole. So, with that said, here's Scott.
Being a new night vision buyer in 2023 is a pretty challenging task. I know this because I've worked with about 1,000 new night vision buyers, or in some cases repeat night vision buyers, for the last 4 years over the history of Nocturnality. There's way more choices today than there ever were, say, if you were a new night vision buyer in 2013 or 2003. The technology's been around for quite some time, and the commercial market has existed for the better part of 2 decades. And one of the challenges that we face today is just the sheer number of choices that are out there for night vision devices, for options and configurations. And this leads to paralysis by analysis in a lot of cases. And really, when we're talking about technology and a consumer good that is on par with night vision, the cost, $10,000, 5 figures in some cases, the natural human tendency is just, you want to get it right, and you want to do research, and you want to spend a lot of effort making sure that you're doing the right thing for you. Unfortunately, with how the market is today, that rarely ends up being the case the first time for first-time buyers. So the point of this video is to go over and present information that will help alleviate a lot of the current challenges that first-time and relatively new night vision buyers face, and introduce some products that we're going to be offering in association with T.REX Arms through Nocturnality that will make the first-time buying process for night vision hopefully a lot better and easier. So the big challenges that we see for first-time buyers and for new night vision buyers right now, I already mentioned an overabundance of choice of options. When you don't have a lot of frame of reference and experience with all the different options, because night vision is very expensive, so that's not really realistic for most buyers to purchase everything and try before you buy in any significant way. That many options, it can become problematic. It becomes difficult to, emotionally invest and make the decision for what you're going to spend what amounts to a lot of money on. The number of housings and systems, completed systems and image tubes, even aftermarket customization elements, it really mounts up. And we find that with Nocturnality, working with these customers, that despite a lot of people spending a ton of research time on the internet and in communities and discussions with friends and people on the internet, despite all that time spent, they're really not, they don't feel well prepared. They don't feel confident in making the choice, the selection of a device, for themselves, and they really end up more confused than when they started. And so that's one of the biggest things that we're working to try to alleviate. Another issue is the abundance of information, especially on the internet, related to night vision. Now, information can be helpful or hurtful, and there's a difference between information and education. Information is out there everywhere these days, and we tend to gorge on information, and especially when it comes to the purchase of a multi-$1,000 device. So there's no surprise there that a lot of the information related to night vision on the internet is full of misconceptions. It's not necessarily based in the amount of experience that really makes it helpful. And so that's really the difference between information and education when it comes to this topic. Education, as we all know, has to stem from experience and has to stem from something, hours spent using different devices or testing that's being done on the different products, and that type of thing. So there's tons of information, but it's not necessarily a good thing because it's leaving people more confused or with the wrong perception of different elements of the night vision experience. And the final, which I think is most important challenge and issue with the night vision market today that really complicates the first time buying process, is that in the night vision industry, unlike other technology industries out there, there is not a involvement and a presence from the leading manufacturers and technology developers in the market itself when it comes to civilian night vision purchasing. These companies that actually make the products, the housings, the image intensifiers, all the magic, they do not participate directly in providing technical details and information to any meaningful degree to the civilian market. They don't police the flow of information and misconceptions and inaccuracies that ultimately end up on the internet. They're not really, these companies aren't really invested per se in civilian ownership of night vision. Not that they don't want civilians to own the product, it's just they're not focused on this aspect of the market. So leaving that vacuum of expertise and educational content, other entities are left to try to fill that void. Nocturnality is attempting to do that with our social media content as well, and partnering with T.REX Arms is one of the main objectives that we hope to fulfill for the market itself. Stepping up and providing a lot of this educational content to help set the expectations for new buyers, make sure that everyone is armed with the correct and experience-based information that will ultimately lead to a good experience. All right, so the rest of this video we're going to spend first talking about information that new night vision buyers ultimately need to understand to have the right buyer experience, and also to have really to set the expectations to combat some of the misconceptions and some of the inaccuracies that you'll inevitably run into if you just kind of go out there and kind of have a crack at it yourself. This will be help with the efficient exploration of products on the market, and it'll also really help enhance the ownership when you first actually do get that first night vision device. You won't have quite as many kind of questions that really you don't know where to take and what to do with. So we're going to talk about that first. We're going to go over some of the common new night vision user mistakes that we've seen at Nocturnality over the last 4 years. We've dealt with about 1,000 customers so far in our history, so we've kind of gathered some insights from those interactions. We've seen some common trends, and we'll put those out there so that you guys can hopefully be aware of them and ultimately avoid them. And then we'll get into talking about some specific night vision devices, some features, as well as kind of like the technical side of things for when you do eventually feel confident and ready to kind of delve into it at a deeper level. You're not jumping right into that and kind of making things more confusing than they need to be to start. We will eventually get to that, and the goal of the video really is to give the viewer, especially the first time night vision buyer, the confidence and the understanding and the perception that is needed to make an informed decision early on in this video, and then everything after that, when we get into kind of the technical nitty-gritty stuff, that's just icing on the cake to better understand how the technology works once it's in your hands, and then you'll have a good understanding, and not have all of the kind of the bad taste and the negative experiences that can sometimes happen when you just don't know what's going on with these things, but you've paid a lot of money to get them. Okay, so the first thing we're actually going to talk about might seem a little strange at first. We're not going to jump into device features and image intensification technology at all. Actually, what we're going to talk about is a little bit of the history of night vision and how it relates to the commercial market, civilian buyers, even non-civilian buyers, really, law enforcement, but especially the first time or relatively new night vision buyer. Where I'm going with this is that a phrase that I end up using a lot is that night vision, if I were watching this video 10 years ago when I was first getting into night vision, I would say to myself, night vision is not meant for you. This isn't a commentary on rights. It's not that it's should or shouldn't be available. It's that it was not developed from the ground up for civilian purposes, and that's important because there's a certain set of kind of boundaries and barriers that you'll inevitably run into the more you use night vision that stem back to the history and the development of the technology itself, the underlying night vision technology. This has to do with industry structure, everything from how image tubes are manufactured and sold, how sometimes they might behave differently even though they're supposed to be the same. All these kind of anomalies. If you've ever run into questions like, why does one image tube cost more or less than another one that's supposed to be the exact same? Or why does my night vision device behave a little bit differently than my friend's night vision device? Is mine defective or something like that? These type of kind of strange things that you'll run into as you experience more and more night vision can really ultimately be explained by the concept of, night vision was not developed as a consumer technology. It was developed as a military technology. And the way that night vision is, ultimately sold is that the commercial side of things is kind of an offshoot of the main directive for night vision, which is military use. And, ultimately that goes back to explaining a lot of some of the things that have led to consumers thinking or having the perception that the night vision industry is a little bit shady, or there's some dishonest practices going on behind the scenes. Surely throughout history there have been, but most of some of these inconsistencies end up being perceived as wrongdoing for the customer, and that has left a bad taste in the mouths of some consumers over time as they've kind of evaluated night vision over the years. But really what it ties back to is that night vision is not, still to this day is not sold and developed primarily as a consumer technology. The exchange of goods or the exchange of money for goods is not really, those principles do not really apply to a lot of the tenets of night vision, because we're buying and selling products that were originally developed to serve the needs of the Department of Defense and the Armed Services, who have a whole different standard and set of guidelines that they developed the technology around. And touching on that night vision is not meant for you concept a little bit more, the most common thing that we see related to that on the consumer market and that we deal with, interacting with customers, this is a difficult one for people to wrap their heads around. So I understand certainly, is something like when it comes to the inherent image defects in a night vision tube, a dark spot or a little line, a squiggle, something like that. We call them cosmetic defects or blems. They're often called. It's difficult for people to wrap their heads around how could one of the more expensive night vision devices in the world, the PVS-31 Alpha, how could a set of these have a noticeable cosmetic defect in the image and still be considered, a new product, not a defective product, when something like a much less expensive single tube or even dual tube system like these with a different image tube in it have a perfectly clean image? How is it that the most expensive goggle could have something that looks like a visible defect when others do not, and that still be an acceptable practice? Again, the answer is it goes back to night vision was not intended as a consumer product, and these were intended as military ground systems where small image defects don't degrade the ability for the user to do any specific task. It's just a byproduct of the manufacturing process, and some tubes have blems and some tubes don't have blems, but at the end of the day, they all perform equivalently the same. All right, so the next topic, when we talk about information that buyers need to have beforehand, before you go into the nitty-gritty details, one of the most important things to understand is the difference between what we would call a factory night vision device versus a custom night vision device. And Nocturnality is in the business of building primarily custom night vision devices, although we do sell some factory night vision devices as well. The difference is fairly self-explanatory. Custom night vision devices are a non-standard combination of the core components that make up a night vision device, whereas a factory night vision device is essentially a set configuration that can be purchased from one source, one supplier, who's involved in the design of the total system. A night vision system is a complete working device consisting of a housing, some people refer to it kind of like a shell, where the image tubes, which is the core component, sit inside, and then they're finished off usually with optical elements that focus the image and bend light in the way that makes sense and we can look through and see things. That's a system. In a factory night vision device like this PVS-31 Alpha made by L3 Harris, this is basically what you see is what you get. You purchase a PVS-31 Alpha, it's built to a certain set of specifications, but all of them are essentially supposed to be the same. The reality of that purchase is that image tubes are all unique, and the level of cosmetic defect or the performance level of the image tubes actually will vary device to device, but not in a meaningful way. So you're buying a known quantity, and the benefit of buying a factory night vision device, for example, typically is because you're someone who's interested in purchasing a device with a lot of history, with the support of a well-known entity behind it, one that's got a proven track record of service, something like that. That's contrasted by a custom night vision device where a company like Nocturnality or another supplier will have a housing type. Maybe it's something like this. Maybe it's one of these other ones here that you've identified that you're interested in building out, and then you make the choice of the image tube that is ultimately assembled inside the device, and maybe even other custom elements like the optic components that go on it to finish the device, or aftermarket accessories, things like that. So it's a lot more of a cooperative approach. It's ultimately a lot more complex, and for some buyers a confusing approach, because this is kind of presented as sort of, I think, the current standard of the night vision industry is, you got to figure out what you want, and you got to choose your image tube, and you have to choose all these other things. And a good custom shop can take a lot of that work off your shoulders and make suggestions themselves, but that's only if they have the right level of experience to really understand the needs and to and carry the right products and all those things. The factory night vision device process is meant or intended to be a simpler, more straightforward buying process, and really was developed for the professional user in mind to sell to institutions and entities, and who don't want to go through that same process en masse to arrive at something like this. All right, so we talked a little bit about what elements, kind of core elements, make up a complete night vision system. The most important of those elements typically is considered the image tube, which is inside these devices, and that is kind of what makes the magic happen. Let's talk a little bit about what new buyers need to understand specifically about image tubes. Later in the video, we'll talk about specific manufacturers and image tube technologies and specifications and all those things. But if we zoom out from that a little bit and take a higher level view, what ultimately we think consumers and early night vision buyers need to focus on are purchasing new production image tubes that are warranted, Ideally ones that come with a data record which shows not only the relevant test specifications, but also dates the manufacturer, calls out the which specific grade of image tube it is, this other type of information. And that gets into what is a tube grade. You can purchase tube types from different manufacturers, L3 or L-bit, for example, but within each of those tube manufacturers also are specific grades of tubes. Grades typically refers to, there's typically two categorizations. There's commercial grade tubes as well as mil-spec grade tubes. And there's even within those two categories further subcategorizations that are often discussed online that can be confusing for first-time buyers to really wrap their heads around. Separating it just at a basic level into commercial grade tubes versus mil-spec grade tubes is a good way to conceptualize things, especially when you are shopping around and see, okay, well, this tube from this manufacturer costs a lot less than this other one, but on paper they seem to be very similar, or I don't understand why one costs less or more than the other when they're coming from the same source and they're supposed to be the same thing. That is an important tenet to understand, because new buyers can have the wrong perception of which tubes can perform to what standard, and ultimately which might be right for them, as well as when you talk about commercial grade tubes maybe being held to a lower set of standards versus mil-spec grade tubes. Even though they're produced the same way, image tubes don't all come out the production line the same, with the same performance and the same cosmetic qualities. They often come out very different. And so manufacturers can grade them within either the commercial mil-spec framework, and then again also within those frameworks even into a tiered system. So the understanding that whole scenario and from the manufacturer's perspective actually is really helpful for buyers to know what they're getting, and ultimately even to know what makes sense for them budget-wise, performance-wise, and to set the expectations as far as what the final product will look like. But again, that's a more of a custom night vision kind of entrapment, and it also introduces a lot more things that buyers maybe might obsess over or feel the need to research into perpetuity, and then ultimately come out more confused than they were when they started. And this brings us to somewhat of a contentious topic that I like to kind of summarize or title as the number one rule of buying night vision is wrong. Historically speaking, it's not flat out wrong, but historically speaking, if you've done any research into night vision, or maybe you've been around the communities online or something like that, you might be familiar with kind of the adage of invest in your tubes, or when you're more specifically, when you're looking at, you have a budget to spend that you're looking to spend on night vision, how do you appropriate those funds? A lot of the common, advice, especially historically, would be, well, invest in your tubes. The tubes are the most important part of the system. They're what actually makes, the night vision part of the device possible. So you should buy the best tubes that you can, and that's where, your money should go. And the rest of it, by extension, that advice means the rest of it is not that important. This advice originated at a different time in the commercial night vision market's history, when there were much fewer choices, and there was a little bit more of a performance gap between various manufacturers' tubes, as well as the inter-batch performance gap of a given manufacturer's tubes at any given time. So investing in your tubes, full stop, made sense to a degree, historically speaking. But I would argue that today that line of thinking is a little bit dangerous for the first-time user, and I'll explain why. The sheer choice of system type as well as image tube type today necessitates that if you were to only invest in your tubes and kind of disregard the other elements that we've already covered a little bit, housings, optics, things like that, it's possible to end up with a very expensive night vision device that is hamstrung, for the lack of a better term, by the lowest quality component of the overall system. And now there are housings and systems which the choice is a great thing, but the quality spectrum is now wider than it used to be. Historically, night vision, springing off of what the DoD has developed, all of the commercial choices were essentially, DoD quality devices, and that meant that the quality gap was not very wide from choice to choice. You had PVS 14s, you had PVS 15s, maybe 31s, depending on when you got into it. Not huge gaps in quality necessarily. But today there's many more systems of varying degrees of quality and price, which is a good thing ultimately for consumers to have access to. But the dangerous part of the equation is if only focusing on the image tube, you have the potential to spend a lot of money for a device that does not perform as well as one with, an image tube that is only a tiny bit, maybe less high performing on paper than the one you ultimately went with because you invested in your tubes. Ultimately, we think that now the paradigm has shifted a little bit, and you need to invest in a complete device rather than looking at it only from the perspective of the image tube, because a low quality device or a device built with low quality components but very top tier image tubes still ultimately will perform in some ways as a low quality device, but it will cost a lot of money. So you need to have the elements in balance ultimately to get the best experience and to most effectively use your night vision budget and get out there and be able to train and have the experience that maybe your other night vision buddies are having with their devices. All right, so now we're going to transition a little bit and talk about the past several years at Nocturnality, some of the things that we've noticed, common new night vision buyer and user mistakes that we see that we think can be avoided. And these are all going to be related to kind of the process of selecting a night vision device, purchasing it, not so much the use specifically, but we will get into that a little bit later in the video. The first one I want to talk about is, we've already mentioned a little bit at this point already, is gorging on information when it comes to night vision. This is a counterproductive experience almost all of the time, and it's something that's very easy to do. We already mentioned, just the mass proliferation of night vision content, night vision information online, and the difference between information and whether it can be helpful or hurtful. So gorging on information when it comes to night vision is a common practice, but it's not necessarily helping you. A lot of times you're picking up misconceptions or inaccuracies that could potentially filter down into your own purchasing experience or direction. So we've already mentioned that learning and education has to flow out of experience. What you should, ultimately, hopefully be doing is trying to seek out experience, whether it's through the support of a partner, a vendor in the night vision space, or maybe it's on your own. Seek out things like, buddies that have night vision that you can get your hands on, or maybe pay for a night vision rental. Even take a night vision class where there's a rental available, something like that. Building your own basis of experience with night vision is going to be vastly more helpful than spending hours just reading everything that's out there on the internet with regards to night vision technology. Building up that experience base we think is super important, and it doesn't have to just be us, the vendor community, doing that and then putting it out there. You can also be active in doing that. So we think that that's very important. Closely related to that, another common mistake that we see all the time are new users missing the opportunities to gain experience once they have night vision. This usually happens when you have the mindset of night vision is a tool for flat range training exclusively. Getting time on a night-friendly range is notoriously difficult. So that right there can just limit the amount of experience that you get with night vision once you've acquired it. Get out there and definitely use night vision for other things, whether it be hiking, maybe it's driving a recreational vehicle that you already have, doing a different, recreational activity that you couldn't do before because you just couldn't see, at night. Not in a serious manner, but, just getting the experience of doing things, doing tasks, and experiencing, what the world is like at night with night vision goes a long way in understanding, some of the quirks on related to using night vision and kind of how they behave, the way they behave, picking up things on lighting conditions and shadows, how the ambient environment affects the image, all those types of things. All right, and then the last new user mistake that we want to touch on is a little bit more related to the use of night vision, and that is not spending enough time understanding what the core fundamentals of night vision use are. These are the things that really dictate the quality of the experience that you have when using night vision, as well as maybe your performance if you're doing task-related things. This is stuff like understanding how specifically to focus these devices, your specific device to your vision, what proper focus actually looks like so that you can know whether or not it's correct, as well as understanding things like if you're using an infrared aiming laser, the proper zeroing theory or a useful zeroing theory for your specific setup, knowing what the bullet is doing downrange rather than just kind of dialing it in and sending it and hoping for the best. You end up spending a lot of time not really accomplishing a whole lot, chasing a zero around. And the last one is the mechanical alignment of your night vision setup. And what I mean by mechanical alignment is when this is set up on your head, is it actually mechanically aligned so that your night vision device can be viewed properly? It could even come down to something like, setting the pod adjustment width to the optimal level. Some users, a surprisingly high degree of new users, don't necessarily know what the answers to all these things are, and if you don't ever see it correct, you won't ever know, what the standard should be. So it definitely helps to take some classes, if you don't have a resource to explain some of those things, and then definitely getting out there and experiencing a lot of this for yourself and making a conscious effort to take mental notes on what's working or if something doesn't feel right, and doing all that stuff and mastering that stuff before you get into maybe the running and gunning and a lot of the other cool stuff that ultimately we want to be able to do, but you need to understand the fundamentals before you get into that. Okay, so we've talked about what I would consider kind of like the absolute basics. At this point, you could realistically probably go and have a good understanding of how the night vision, kind of industry works, what the absolute basics are, and hopefully be armed with, the right perceptions on which direction you might want to go. Everybody's application is different, but we don't want to go into this decision with misconceptions and, talked about some mistakes that, are common, to avoid those. Make sure that everyone is armed with the correct and experience-based information that will ultimately lead to a good experience.
We hope that information was useful for you all. Like I said earlier in the video, this is the information that most of us need to make a decision on what kind of device we should be saving up for. But for those of you that are interested in that deep dive into the nerd stuff, the stuff that when Scott came, he did a presentation for us. He explained a lot of this to us. A lot of it went over my head. It was very hard to understand some of it. But for those of you that really want to understand those things, we have a part 2 that is coming, and you guys can watch that to learn even more about night vision. But until then, we'll see you next time.